So tonight we have a talk from Austin. He was sacked for being gay, which is the name of the talk, and he's going to explain about his experiences in life over the last however many years. I don't want to guess your age there, Austin.
32.
32, over the last 21 years. So he's going to give us a more insightful talk than I can ever give. So over to Austin.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my life in general and where that has fitted in to LGBT rights in the last couple of decades. And it starts right across the river here because I was brought up in Middlesbrough. I went to school in Williebanks Junior School, and at that time, around about 8 and a half, I realised that I was gay. And not that the word gay in those days was coined. It wasn't coined till I was in my early 20s. But I did notice boys in the classroom, and my feelings for those were somewhat different to the girls, and that's how I identify now that I knew at about 8 and a half that I was gay. Then I went to big school, which was Stainsby, and pop fans might remember Chris Rea having a big hit with Stainsby Girls. I went to Stainsby Boys. It wasn't the only connection with pop music, because I went to school with a guy called Collie, who now lives in Phoenix, Arizona, and looks after Eric Clapton. So there we go. Stainsby Boys School, where I had lots of sex. Wonderful sex, without, of course, in those days, being gay, because we believed two things. One, we believed that queers were these horrible men that hung around in horrible raincoats in shop doorways, and we weren't one of those. And we also believed in those days that, of course, all boys through the puberty period went through this homosexual phase. So we had a wonderful time without being identified. When I was 13 and a half, on the night that President Kennedy was assassinated, the 22nd of November 1963, I was right here in Stockton at the Globe Theatre watching the Beatles, which was the first of my 4 very slight connections with the Beatles. And a couple of years later saw the Seekers, just a few months, about 3 or 4 months before they had their first big hit. The other important thing at that time was that I was brought up in Cambridge Road Baptist Church. We just passed the tabernacle on the way in, and a lot of my friends then went over to the tabernacle, though I never did. At 18, I was baptized, which was the custom of the Baptist Church in those days. But sadly, since then, although I have grown to love the message of love and Jesus' message of love, I have also grown to hate, loathe, and detest the Christian Church and what it has done to that message. Rather a sad little anecdote then from that time was that on a Sunday night after the church service we had a youth group, and there was one boy about my age, about 15, 16 at the time. He always used to leave an hour early because he had to go from Acklam into the centre of Middlesbrough to get his bus home to one of the housing estates. Many years later, when we were in our late 20s, I met up with him again and found out that not only was he gay, but he made that the excuse because he went into the centre of Middlesbrough and did half an hour's cottaging in the toilets at the bus station before he got his bus back home. Sadly, a few years later, in his early 30s, he committed suicide. At 19, I went to university, the University of Bradford, where actually I lived, apart from a couple of spells in London and Brighton, I lived for the next 30 years. My first degree was pretty uneventful. I drank and memorised a periodic table. I did chemistry. But it was during my PhD in the mid-70s that I sort of lost my heterosexual virginity. I still wasn't out at that point. But when I finished that, I went down to London, to Imperial College, to do some research, with the two subsidiary reasons that one, I knew that I wanted to be a singer at some point, and I wanted to get to know the concert venues in London, and also I decided late 20s it was about time I came out of the proverbial closet, and thought it would be easier to do that in a new city, and particularly the capital. After that I moved back to Bradford to start a short career in music and music theatre, and at that time my hobby became the Samaritans, and then when I started the Samaritans, quite shortly after that I started working for Bradford Gay Switchboard, and I was there in Bradford last weekend to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the founding of Bradford Gay Switchboard, which I joined just a few years after they had founded. In 1987, I gave up singing and did a little bit of supply teaching while I was thinking what to do next. But 2 weeks before Christmas in that year, Margaret Thatcher decided what I was going to do next. I just took my godson to see Twelfth Night in Stratford last week, and Shakespeare scholars might know that, well, I certainly wasn't born great, and I certainly didn't achieve greatness, but thanks to Margaret Thatcher, I had it certainly thrust upon me, at least for the 15 minutes of Andy Warhol fame, because 2 weeks before Christmas 1987, the Thatcher government introduced Clause 27 into the House of Commons, and the very next morning I was sacked for being gay from an upper school. For those of you that remember upper schools, I was first sacked from the school for being gay, but when it got into the press, the Director of Education had necessarily had to tell a lot of lies about the situation to protect his own back, and when the press came to me, I virtually said, he's telling a pack of lies. And for that reason, I was then sacked from the whole of Bradford Education Authority. I'm sure they thought I was going to dye my hair, change my name, and go and live on the Isle of Skye. But instead, I rolled up my sleeves, rather like today, not that I'm going to fight you, but I rolled up my sleeves and said, if you want to fight, you've got one. And 3 or 4 months later, I was reinstated with an apology. A couple of nice things happened around that time. Just before I was sacked, about 3 months before that, I met Drew, my partner. We're still together, and if you do the maths, you realise that we just had our 30th anniversary last September. And the other the other thing that happened was that I was given 3 jobs by people that wanted to support me and gay rights at that time. I gave a course on men and masculinity to the women and men teachers in Bradford with Professor Hearn, who was then the professor at Applied Social Studies in the University of Bradford. I also lectured on Miss Julie and August Strindberg and the turn of the century avant-garde theatre. And also I, along with a rather prominent Jew in Bradford and the woman that ran the roadside stop for the Gypsies and Travellers, we wrote a training pack to accompany the exhibition Anne Frank in the World, which was then touring in America, Europe, and another one in the Far East. We wrote this training pack to bring those Holocaust prejudices up to date. And a year or 2 later, I got some communication from America, which was quite interesting, that this exhibition with the training pack for teachers had arrived in this big city in America. I'm afraid I've forgotten which city it was. But the Director of Education said, the training pack is fine, but we must remove the section on gay and lesbian rights. Fortunately, it was being financed by a multi-billion-dollar corporation, and the chief executive rang very right on, for back in those days, rang the Director of Education and said, if you remove this section from the training pack, we will not fund a cent. because money talks, it was put back in, and it was nice to hear. But around that time, of course, I'd become quite a cause célèbre with Clause 27 and all that was going on in those late 80s with the Thatcher government. I had my first flirtation with pre-Stonewall, before it had been founded, when I was the first person, or the person to introduce Ian McKellen when he gave his first ever gay rights speech. I met him from the station and thought he was the grumpiest person that I'd ever met in my life. But when we got into the taxi, I realised that he wasn't grumpy at all. He was just absolutely terrified of giving this speech. He thought he was going to be speaking to all the homophobes in Leeds College of Music, where this homophobia had taken place. And I reassured him that it wasn't, and we had a wonderful afternoon. And he told me then, on that occasion, that he was first attracted to me as a person, even before he'd met me, because he said we were both sacked for being gay. He said, you were sacked from an upper school in Bradford, I was sacked from Hollywood. So we did Stop the Clause March, where my second little flirtation with the Beatles, I featured on a postcard that was used for gay and lesbian rights with Michael Cashman, myself, and Julian Lennon, who was not gay, but he turned out to support the cause. It was a little bit like the miners' cause in those days. A lot of people that weren't miners supported them because they realised what Thatcher was doing. In 1989, I did get a job from the Samaritans in counselling. I did get a job down in Brighton at the Sussex Aid Centre. I was the last counsellor to be appointed by Graham Wilkinson before he died. And the Guardian said he was one of the unsung heroes of the 1980s. So after that year, I went back to Bradford, and then it was when I started to work more seriously for Stonewall. And May asked me if I would just digress a little to give the story of Stonewall and how that came to be a word that is now associated with gay and lesbian rights. Forgive me if some of you already know this, but Stonewall Jackson, Thomas Jackson, was the Confederate general in the American Civil War, became very famous, and a bar in Greenwich Village, New York, was named after him, the Stonewall Inn. And as the years went by, early 1960s, it became a gay bar. Not just a gay bar, but it became a bar that was frequented by drag queens and the more effeminate side of gay men, which is significant. This bar was, because of the drag queens, this bar was raided with monotonous regularity, maybe once or twice every week, by the police, who didn't make any charges, but just arrested 2, 3 or 4 drag queens, took them to the police station, kept them in a cell for a few hours, and then let them go, but they had to suffer the ignominy of walking home in stiletto heels and drag back the 2 miles to Greenwich Village. But in June in 1969, the bar had been coincidentally raided 9 times on the trot. 9 consecutive nights it had been raided, and on the 10th night, it was 22nd of June 1969, the night that Judy Garland had died, so emotions were very high, particularly among the drag queens in Greenwich Village. And when 2 or 3 or 4 police officers went in to do their usual harassment, these drag queens basically just kicked shit out of these police officers, threw them out of the bar, and of course locked and barred the doors. They got onto the phone to their gay friends, and gay friends friends, and so did the police. They got onto the phone for reinforcements from the police, and the ensuing battle lasted for 3 days and 3 nights. And eventually, of course, the gay men were never going to win, but eventually they only lost because the police had to call for reinforcements from upstate New York and also the army. But the fact that it had taken 3 days and 3 nights for them to battle these effeminate gay men sent shockwaves through America, particularly in San Francisco, and worldwide, particularly in London and in Sydney, in Australia. Because this was the first time that gay men had decided to make their own agenda and say, we are going to fight for our rights. Very, very important. Before that, in this country, we had things like the Homosexual Law Report, Reform Society, and the Albany Trust, which basically were very well-meaning heterosexual do-gooders on our behalf. And indeed, remember that the 1957 Wolfenden Report, which led to the 1967 Act, which decriminalised sex between men, was based basically on the theory that these poor, sick men should be decriminalised so that they had the freedom to go to their doctors and demand a cure. So you can understand that Stonewall was kind of very important. And if you want to take that further, dig out a DVD. It's been on telly a couple of times, but not in recent years. It's an hour-and-a-half documentary called Before Stonewall. And so that was like detailing the 50 or so years before 1969, with some wonderful, wonderful stories. I can recommend it. It's a very interesting video. The one that always comes to mind is this old lesbian talking about the time that no less than Eisenhower, before he was president, when he was still a general, came to visit this unit, which had 5 big blocks staffed by women doing all the secretarial business for the American Armed Forces. And he said, I've been told that there is lesbianism in these units. And he said, my command is that you root it out and sack these people from the armed forces. And she said, yes, sir, certainly, sir. But I think you ought to know that my name will be at the top of that list. And her assistant immediately stood forward and said, no, sir, I insist that the list is alphabetical, and my name will be at the top. And then she explained that all these 5 units would have to be shut down because there would be about half a dozen women, heterosexual women, left in the whole of the unit. And after a 20, 30-second pause, he just looked and said, forget that last order, and just walked out. But rather annoyingly, a wonderful story that came from Hyde Park in London was that these 2 gay men were in the blackout during the war, were making out under a bush, and one of our police constables came by and heard some rustling, got his torch out and said, what's going on here then? And when he saw that it was 2 men having sex, he just said, oh, sorry to intrude, lads. He said, don't be too late home. And he went on. The annoying thing is, of course, that as soon as the war finished, and we didn't need every available fit man to fight the war, it went back to status quo, and we were once again locked up in prison. So that was a little bit of background of Stonewall. So at that time, the late 80s, early 90s, the Stonewall group in this country was formed with Ian McKellen, who wasn't a Hollywood star at that point, but he was a very famous actor, and Michael Cashman, the actor who was just retired from 15 years as a European MEP, who was at the time playing Colin on EastEnders. You all look so wonderfully young, you won't remember that at all. But, and also Simon Fanshawe, the comedian, who was the resident comedian at that time on Esther Ranson's Saturday night programme, That's Life, which was a very famous programme at that time. But they appointed a man called Tim Barnett as the executive director. He described himself as the first professional homosexual in the country. And the first thing that I did with, the first couple of things I did with Stonewall was relating to the church, because of course I had the arguments from being brought up in Cambridge Road Baptist Church just over the river. The first thing I did was write a reply to the Osborne report, Osborne being June Osborne, who recently was enthroned as the Bishop of Llandaff in Cardiff. And the second thing I did jointly with with Richard Kirker of the Lesbian and Gay Christian Movement was to write a booklet called Call to Action, which was given to all the Synod members, which was launched in a room in the Houses of Parliament, and we were bundled out at 2 o'clock on the dot by Tony Benn, who had booked the room for his services. And the third thing, slight connection with where I'm speaking today, I had a very nice meeting with the very controversial Bishop of Durham, David Jenkins, from a few years ago, before you will remember, and persuaded him to basically give a public talk where he said that what is passed in Parliament shouldn't be swayed by the Christian Church. The Christian Church, in a sense, can believe what it wants, but that shouldn't sway a law that is being passed for the whole of the population. I then started to do the main thing that I did for Stonewall, which was to organise SPAN, S-P-A-N, the Stonewall Postal Action Network. I had done some work for Urgent Action for Amnesty International some years earlier, and so I organised a similar scheme. The first thing we did was, the first letter that went out, campaigning letter, was against Virginia Bottomley, Thatcher's Minister for Health, who was having a go at lesbian and gay men being fit to adopt and foster children. I rang Tim, a very good friend. He stayed with me several times, and I've stayed with him in Cape Town when he was over there. I rang him and said, "Was everything fine?" He said, "Yeah, everything's fine." He said, "Except you spelt Bottomley wrong." And I said, "Oh, thank God for that." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, I could have spelt Virginia wrong, couldn't I?" But we did lots of causes. The Isle of Man around that time that was still needed to change their laws. We targeted the railway police, and about 60 campaigns on a monthly basis. I had a couple of interesting people join the scheme. One was Henry of Drop the Dead Donkey, David Swift, was Clive Swift's brother. You might remember Keeping Up Appearances, you might remember Drop the Dead Donkey, but only because your grandparents will have got them on video. And I also had Nadia Dinshaw, who I met in Jersey when I was on holiday with my mother, who was the guy that kept the offshore account for the Liberal Party, which was used to nobble Norman Scott in that Jeremy Thorpe scandal of the late 1970s. And he then, at that time, used to write these little prayer books with David Steele. Quite an incredible guy. Okay, so I worked with Tim Barnett for several years. As I say, we're still very good friends. I remember once telephoning him when he was in New Zealand. He was a member of the government in New Zealand when he moved over there with his boyfriend. He now has a Maori boyfriend that he's been with for many years. Had a great wedding on one of the Maori plantations. It was quite something for New Zealand in those days. But I rang him one night and there's all this whooping and hollering in the background. He said, "I'm sorry about the noise." He said, "I've got a party of prostitutes." And I said, "Well, it's rather unusual." He said, "Yes." He said, "Because this afternoon they just legalised, the government just legalised prostitution, and I was the MP that introduced the bill and forced it through Parliament." Then when he left, there was a forgotten, now if you look in the information on Stonewall, the forgotten Anne Bond, who was only with Stonewall for about 4 weeks, but she was a right bonny lass and used to drink pints of Newquay Brown. So there's another little connection with the Northeast. I got on wonderfully with her, but it was only going to be 4 weeks that she was there. And then Angela Mason came along. And I only really met Angela Mason on one occasion, and that was before I spoke at Westminster Central Hall. There was a wonderful lesbian called Elizabeth Stewart, who was a theologian at the time in South Wales at the University of Mid Glamorgan, and she'd written, she's now director of Winchester College, but she'd written this book called Daring to Speak Love's Name, which was prayers and liturgy and the litany for gay men and lesbians. And it was to be published by the SPCK, the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge, which was like the publishing wing of the Church of England. And their patron was always the Archbishop of Canterbury, who at that time was George Carey. And rather stupidly, he protested by saying, if you publish this book, I will withdraw my patronage from it. We're not going to have this at all. Not realising, of course, that once he had kind of banned the book from SPCK, every publisher in London was wanting to snatch a hand off for it to be published. So it was published very soon after that, and it was launched in Westminster Central Hall, and I gave a speech on behalf of Stonewall. Met Angela Mason just before that, and she realised that my politics was way to the left of Peter Tatchell, and I think she said, we can't really have this guy on board working for Stonewall. I also don't think she liked the idea that I was running Stonewall from Bradford. I was running the Stonewall Postal Action Network from Bradford, and because she was extremely bad on communication, I just did it. I ran it on my own. I never rang her and said, is this okay? Because I could never run her. She never gave me her personal number. And when you rang Stonewall, you just got the answer machine and nobody could ever get through. So I stopped SPAN, but immediately started LAGPAN, the Lesbian and Gay Postal Action Network, and ran that for a few more years, 2 years, I think, around about that. In the next few years, I was still, did a bit of work on television. I came up to Tyne's Television to Newcastle to do a show called Robson's Personal Call. The least said about that, the better. I also went over to Granada to do an upfront programme with Geoffrey Dickens, the MP for Littleborough and Saddleworth. The problem was these were one of the problems was that these programmes went out very late on a Friday night, and it was audience and people ringing in, and well, Manchester, never mind, Newcastle, late on a Friday night, everybody's pissed, you know. And I think they pulled the plug on Robson's Personal Call, and the same with Granada's up front. I did quite a bit with Radio Leeds, some very, very nice programmes I did with Claire Rayner, and if you remember, surprisingly enough, Edwina Curry, who I did meet many years later, who was this, I mean, shining star in this Thatcher's government. She's remembered for salmonella and eggs, but actually she opposed the whole of the Thatcher government every little way on gay and lesbian rights. She said, you know, you're wrong, you're absolutely wrong. A great supporter on Radio Leeds, until I outed Michael Portillo and Peter Lilly. And they were rather furious with me and said, you can't out people like that without their permission. And I looked straight at him and said, well, that's what you did with me. And he was a little bit flabbergasted at that. But I didn't do much with them afterwards. Now, the 1990s, through my work earlier, I was invited to lecture for 3 years on men and masculinity on the applied social studies course in Bradford on the, at that time, rather famous, celebrated women's studies course, fronted by the American feminist John Hanmer. I had the most unenviable job in the United Kingdom, trying to persuade 45 radical feminists that actually not all men were bastards. But a little thought from that time. I remember very, very clearly when I first started to come out, going into the centre of Bradford, and at least 3 occasions walking up and down outside the gay pub in Bradford, and then getting on the bus and going back home. It's called internalised homophobia. I knew I was a gay man, but I kind of hated myself and thought, what on earth am I going to meet if I go into that pub? I was rather comforted when I read Nelson Mandela's autobiography, The Long Walk to Freedom, to realise that even after he'd been thinking about racial issues in prison for 27 years, when he came out, he still had a little bit of internalised racism himself. Very comforting to know that even the great Nelson Mandela can have a little bit of internalised racism. So that was my internalised homophobia, his internalised racism. But I did feel that, that one of the failures and disasters of the 40 years of feminism was that an awful lot of boys now grow up hating the fact that they are going to become men. These people that are vilified, at least by the feminists. It's just a thought for you. So, we could call that internalised genderism. At that time, another interesting little part of my time lecturing at the University of Bradford was I became friendly with a guy called Michael Randall, who was one of the guys who sprang George Blake, the spy, from prison, and then when things died down after 4 or 5 months, he put him with his family in the back of his camper van and drove him to Moscow. So now, what am I doing now? In many ways, when I moved to Wales about 20 years ago, I was quite happy to give up formal lesbian and gay rights. Again, I was very comforted by Nelson Mandela's autobiography, because he said that for the whole of his life he had a drive to campaign against the unfairness towards black people. He had to fight racism. But, he said, I should never have got married and I should never have had children. A great admission. And so now I'm very, very contented to be living in Wales mainly as a house husband, looking after my partner who doesn't retire for another 2 years. And my little bit for gay rights is I give Peter Tatchell a few days holiday every couple of years when he comes to the Y Festival, and I managed to persuade him to take a break from his horrendously busy life, and he spends a few days in mid-Wales. So if I can kind of finish with a little message which links into that, and that is that although I'm not formally doing gay and lesbian rights, I still have been doing supply teaching for the last 20 years in mid-Wales, and in every high school that I go into, I insist on giving a full assembly to the whole school where I out myself and the kids know. And a few years ago, one of the last things I did singing-wise in my career, I went to America for 10 weeks with the Black Mountain Male Voice Choir. If you're interested in choirs, you might have seen a choir called Only Men Allowed on television, and the conductor of that broke away from this choir that I went to. So he conducted me for 10 weeks in America, and we had the last night in New York, and of course Welsh Male Voice Choir. They were all going to the the White Horse Tavern, which is by legend where Dylan Thomas drank himself to death one night, and I invited everybody on the tour to join me for the hour and a half before that in the Stonewall Inn bar, which was just round the corner, and over 50% of the boys were there. So my message is that, you know, we can all do something. We can all do something, and it sometimes is those little tiny things that make a lot more difference in our society. You know, that nice Tony Blair went and repealed Section 28, and that nice David Cameron allowed us to marry. Where did that come from? But we need those big gestures. We need those, but also we need the little things throughout our everyday life. Last summer there was a lot of programs on the television celebrating the 50th anniversary of sex between men being decriminalised, and I had a cry when Fionn Whitehead, the actor, gave a program. It was one of these talking heads, these monologues. I don't know if you saw it, but it was called A Grand Day Out, and he'd gone down. He played this kind of 16-year-old who'd left school for the day. He'd gone down to London to be with the vigil when they were deciding whether to bring down the age of consent to 16. They didn't, they left it at 18. But at one point in this, he said when he got there and he looked around at all these other gay men, he said, you know, some of them were really nice guys. And that still brings a tear to my eye, because I remember times when I thought we weren't, you know, we weren't. And it's important things like that to make society know that we're not. I also shed a tear of joy a little while ago when Tom Daly had got another medal, and they said, you must be exhausted now. And he said, yeah, I'm just looking forward to spending a few weeks relaxing with my husband. Those things are so important. I'm not being sponsored by Tesco, but my message is, every little helps. Thank you so much for listening.